So once there was a man who was a really great guy with a lot of potential. But he was a proud man, and there was one thing that he would never do. He would never forgive anyone. He had a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances, but his friends learned rather quickly that if you did something that made Sam mad, he would often stop talking to you, or he would kind of get back at you or do something else. And so that's what people just knew about Sam. But, you know, Sam had a lot of other good qualities and a lot of good characteristics. So, you know, he kind of did well in life. And there was always more friends to have and more acquaintances to get. But just everybody knew how Sam was. But later in life, when Sam got a little older, after he'd gone through many girlfriends and 3 divorces, he noticed that he didn't quite have as many friends as he had before. And there wasn't as many social opportunities as he had. And his children didn't really talk to him that much either. But he still was proud of the fact that he had never forgiven anyone, and he was proud of that. Forgiveness. The power of forgiveness. The act of forgiveness. Are you a forgiving person? Where did you learn to be forgiving? And is it important to you or not? Well, we discovered that it was pretty important to Jesus. We hear Jesus talk about it in his ministry, and as we discovered and reminded again today, he included it in the prayer he taught his disciples. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So it made it into the top 3 or 4 there in his things. And we also know that forgiveness was important to him because if you recall, the first word of Jesus from the cross was, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Forgiveness was an important thing to Jesus. Is it important to us? And why is it important? Have you ever thought about where forgiveness comes from? Dr. Eugene Worley, in his book Exploring the Parables, tells us that the parable that we have today, the parable of the unforgiving servant, is one of 3 parables that Jesus has that are in the category of go and do likewise. And he goes on and makes a point in his book that there's many things, many reasons why Jesus told parables, but there are 3 that are about following the example of the story and living those examples in the spirit of Christ. And the 3 are, the first one is our first parable that we had in the very beginning, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that characteristic was neighborliness. Who was my neighbor? And the second one is one we haven't really dealt with, was the story of the Pharisee and the publican. And that's the story where Jesus says there were 2 men who went down to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a publican, which meant that he was a local contractor for the Romans. And the Pharisee said, Lord, I'm so glad I'm not like other people. I pray 3 times a day, and I fast twice a week, and I'm generous in my giving. And then the publican kneels down and beats his chest and says, Lord, forgive me, a sinner. And Jesus said it was the publican, that man, who went home right with God that day. And the virtue that Jesus was lifting up for that was humility. So we have 2 things that we're supposed to do to follow after Jesus. One is neighborliness, and the other is humility. And then the third one is our story today, forgiveness, the parable of the unforgiving servant. This is the story where, as you heard, Jesus said there was a king, a lord, who had a servant brought before him who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, here's a quiz for you. If you were here a few weeks ago, I told you what a talent was worth. Do you remember what a talent was worth? I said that a talent was worth whole year's pay for 20 years for a day laborer. So in our economy, that's $250,000. So at 10,000 talents, this guy owed his Lord, what did I cite? Now I forgot. $2 billion, $500 million. That was a lot. And the story sort of implies it was either, the guy either lost that through bad investments or embezzlement or not knowing whatever, but, something he couldn't pay back. And it was like, somebody's national debt, sort of. And so, for the Lord, he could have had the man executed. But instead, he was going to humiliate him. And he said, take him off to be sold in the market with his wife and kids and all his possessions. And when the Jews heard that story, they understood that this was a story about Gentiles because Jewish law forbid you sell your wife to pay your debts. And they also understood that in the Gentile world, often slaves not only were slaves, but also subject to sexual abuse. But you heard what the man did. He knelt down and pleaded for more time. And the Lord changed his mind and not only gave him more time, but he just forgave him the whole debt, the whole $2.5 billion. And sent him on his way. And then, as you heard, he came across a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii. And a denarii was about 1 day's pay. So that was $5,000. Owed him $5,000. And you heard what happened. He grabbed him by the neck and said, pay me what you owe me. And the servant said the same thing. He says, give me more time and I'll pay you back. And he didn't give him more time. He said, no, off to debtor's prison. And threw him in the debtor's prison. But when the message got back to the servant, to the Lord, he called the servant back and said, I forgave you the whole amount. Could you not have done the same and sent them off, not this time not to be sold, but for punishment until he could pay? And so Jesus said, and so our Heavenly Father will do the same if we cannot forgive from our heart. It makes it kind of important, doesn't it? When it puts it like that. So if forgiveness is so important, why can't we do it? We can't do it because we can't give up the hurt. And we can't give up the anger that's caused the situation. And so we have to deal with that. So that's why you got to read all of chapter 18, by the way, when you go home today, because Jesus gives us a method of how to engage in forgiveness and reconciliation. It begins with this word I'm carrying around right here, this word right here. The word I. It starts with, I'm upset. I didn't appreciate what you said. That makes me mad. The other person doesn't know that you're upset unless you say so. And so Jesus gives us this method that when we have a concern or a complaint, we go to the person privately and we try to work it out. And if that doesn't work, we take a couple people with us to see if we can reconcile the situation. And if that doesn't work, we go to a bigger body to kind of solve the situation that's causing the angst. But it always starts with I. And if we don't deal with our anger, it often turns to resentment. And Dr. Boyle, a person I like to read about, Rob Boyle, says that resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. If we can't get rid of the anger, then it's all festering in us. And so we go through this process of forgiveness. We go through this process of acknowledging that we have done, that we have been offended or we have been hurt, and to bring that out, and then to seek the reconciliation. And when that happens, the other person hopefully will say, well, I'm sorry, I offended you. I didn't mean to do that. Let's talk about that, or let's talk about the situation. And as you heard today when Peter said, well, how many times am I supposed to do that? 7 times? That was the Jewish law. And Jesus quoted back to Genesis and said, no, not 7, but 77 times, which means forever. Now, what that means is that we still forgive, but we can't deal with the situation. We can't just let the situation go. A spouse that's engaged in violence or harshness, the other spouse can bring that to their attention, and the person can say, I'm sorry, but you don't have to put up with the pain, with the violence. Once again, demand other action. Even in our society, there are things that are going on in our world that we know is unjust and not right. And when it's brought to attention and people acknowledge it and ask for forgiveness, we forgive, but then we want the situation corrected. That's all part of the process. So first we acknowledge, and then we ask. And when we're asked to be forgiven, we grant it. But the last thing that we need to do is to forgo the pain. You see, it's often very common. You've heard the old phrase, forgive and forget. I don't think that's true. We don't forget. We never forget. But we can forgo. We can forgo the hurt and the pain and the situation that causes it so that we can move on. Dr. Rob Voyle, who I quoted before, says that anger is a result by the fact that we demand that the past would have been different. That's where the anger comes from. But we can't do anything about the past, can we? But if we prefer that the difference would have been different, then we have something to talk about. So we can talk about how things are going to be going forward. So when it comes to forgiveness, when people ask for our forgiveness, we are to grant it. And then to work out ways so it doesn't happen again. And then we work on ways to forgo the pain by resolving the situation, turning it over to God, doing whatever it takes so it doesn't weigh us down. Because what does anger do? It just weighs us down like an anchor, so that we're just dragging along, feeling all that weight because we got all this stuff weighing us down. We turn it over to God so that we can walk a different way. That's the power of forgiveness. That's the Jesus way. Once there were 2 women who, by chance, met each other in downtown Houston, and they hadn't seen each other for 15 years, since their college days. And so they went to a local restaurant, and they talked and caught themselves up to date, and pretty soon they realized that it was 8 o'clock at night, and this was back before there were cell phones and texts, so they couldn't, they hadn't told their husbands where they were. So they rushed off to go home, promising to meet again the next day. So they met again the next day to consider their conversation, and the one woman said to the other, well, what was your husband's reaction when you got home so late? And she said, oh, I just explained the situation, and he was fine, and we had a nice evening. It was a little late dinner. And she said, how about you? And she said, well, my husband got historical. And she says, what do you mean? Don't you mean hysterical? She said, no, he got historical. He brought up everything that he was angry and upset about for the last 15 years of our marriage. He was truly historical. What we discover through our parable today is God is not historical. God the nature of God is to forgive and to forgo. And Jesus' teaching today is go and do likewise.